Welcome to the complete series on the basics of Seamly2D. This video breaks it down into 7 different parts, and hopefully by the end you'll be able to use Seamly for some of your creative pursuits. Our first topic is parametric modeling. So this is what you'll see when you open Seamly2D. Everything is grayed out because we don't currently have a draft block open, but that's okay because I'm going to go ahead and click New. I'm going to leave it named Draft Block 1, and I like working in centimeters, so we're going to leave that alone as well. I press OK and it'll generate point A for us, but for now, we're just going to ignore that. When I say Seamly uses parametric modeling, that means we can set parameters, which will be our measurements and variables that we can reference later. So let's start by talking about measurements. If I click the Measurements tab at the top, I can open SeamlyMe, and SeamlyMe comes with Seamly2D, and it allows you to generate your measurement files. So we're just going to go ahead and click New. You can choose between individual or multi-size measurements, but multi-size measurements could probably take their own video. So for today, we're going to click Individual, and since my draft block is in centimeters, I'm going to make sure my measurement file is in centimeters as well. We'll hit OK. Now this can be a little bit overwhelming because you need to add the measurements into your table. So I can go ahead and click Add Known. And this is the list of all the measurements we could possibly use in Seamly2D. It helps to search. So if I were making something like a hat, I might search for head and choose all of the head measurements. When you click a measurement to look at it, it will pull up the appropriate measurement diagram. So that helps and really teaches you how to measure yourself. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a couple of head measurements in there so you can see how they're added to the table. Now, measurements that are built into Seamly come with names. So if I want to reference my head circumference as a parameter later, I'm going to type head_circ in the formula. If you're adding your own measurements, you can just click these measurements that we've chosen and add in the values, like a head circumference is on average about 55 centimeters. Now, I'm not going to save this, but if you want to, go ahead and save it now. I actually have a measurement file I already use, but once you've saved your measurements, go ahead and close SeamlyMe. And I'll go ahead and load my individual measurements. Now I can't show you these tables because I paid for the ASTM chart, and these measurements are copyright protected. You can add custom measurements to a table in SeamlyMe, but think about whether or not that measurement is coming from a body or if it's something else. And if you find that it's something else like ease, or maybe how much of a sleeve cuff should be rolled up, that might be something you want to put in a variables table. So variables works much the same as the measurement table, except they're specific to your pattern and not to somebody's body. So if I wanted something like hat brim length, I could go ahead and give that a solid value of 5 centimeters, and then I could reference that throughout my pattern. Variables are for your pattern. Measurements can be used across patterns as long as you load them in. If you have a measurements file loaded, like let's check and see if I have head circumference currently loaded. Yeah, I do. So I could just say the hat brim length is something like the hat circumference measurement divided by 5. So again, as I go through and I update my measurements, that means if I'm making a pattern for a hat, I can reload measurement files to make a hat that can fit quite a few different people. And if you happen to be making some kind of pattern that doesn't pertain to a human body, like maybe you're making quilt blocks or bags or stuffed animals, you might be able to do your entire project using just the variables table. Now let's recap part 1. Seamly uses parametric modeling, and you need to make sure you're actually using your parameters when you draft your patterns. This will let you resize and reuse your designs later. Remember, if you use a measuring tape to take a measurement from someone's body, that should always go in the measurement table in SeamlyMe. Everything else should go into the variables table. Our second topic covers points and lines. Now we can actually start placing points in Seamly2D. Like I said in the last section, all points start with point A. If you want to look at anything we draw, any objects, you can right-click, go to Properties. You can rename it if you want to, but I usually just leave it as point A, or maybe rename it to A0. The first tool we're going to look at is the point, length, and angle. So we click that to switch to that tool. And if you ever want to go back to being able to select objects and look at their properties, you want to make sure you're clicking the tool pointer up at the top. So anyway, we'll click point, length, and angle, and we'll click point A because that's the only place we can click to generate another point. And everything you create in Seamly2D has to reference something that came before it. So if I click, I now have this line that I can swing around with my pointer. And I think I just want to start by drawing a box. So I'm going to go as horizontal as I can here and click. And one thing I really like about Seamly is there's no guesswork. You can adjust. So if I want to say, well, I want that line to be 10 centimeters, I can click apply and now it's 10 centimeters. It always names the points in order A, A1, A2, all the way through. I've never gone past A99, so I couldn't tell you what happens there. And then we can select the angle. Now I want to take a second just to talk about angles in Seamly2D because they're really important. 0 will give me horizontal to the right. 180 will give me horizontal to the left. And then vertically 90 and 270 are going to be the angles you want to use to go straight up and straight down, respectively. If we put something like a 15-degree angle, we could also go negative 15 degrees. So maybe by looking at these numbers, we've kind of discovered that when we reference an angle in Seamly, it always starts from horizontal and goes counterclockwise. So if I want to go 15, 20, I'm going counterclockwise around until I hit 360 degrees, the number of degrees in a circle, coming back to this point. Nothing bad's going to happen if you type in 360 degrees, but do know that if you go beyond 360, like if I were to type in 365, I would be back at 5 degrees. It just continues to loop around. Anyway, let's set that back to 0, so I have my first point. And if you ever need to come back and examine that again, we can hit Properties and look at it. Next, we're just going to move through these in order. I'm going to click Point on Line. Well, now that I have a line, I need to select the first point and the second point, and the order in which you select them does matter. So I'm going to click A and then A1. Then I have to determine the length of my point. So I can type in 1 for 1 centimeters and it'll put A2, but notice it starts from A1. If I wanted to start from the opposite side, I would have to make sure A1 was my first point and A2 was my second point. Now maybe I don't want to say 1 centimeter, maybe I want this to be a certain portion of line A and A1. So I'm going to click the formula toolbar, which is going to be pretty useful to you. So I'm going to delete that. All of your measurements automatically come up down below that you can grab and use. So if I needed a size, if I needed a back measurement, my custom variables are going to end up there. But also as you create things, the lengths of your lines, your line angles, any curves are going to pop up in there so you can reference what you've already done. So I can grab line A1 and say, well, maybe I want it to be 1/3 of the way. Well, there we go. Or 1/4 of the way. And you can always change the color of your points. I tend to just work in black, but it's something you might want to use later on. We'll hit OK. The next tool we're going to look at is midpoint on a line. So you can select any 2 points. Let's use A and A1, and it automatically populates the current length divided by 2 formula for you. If you wanted to, you could copy paste this formula and use it in the point on line tool for the same effect. But it is kind of convenient just to be able to click and have your midpoint. Now the next tool I'm going to show you is the point on a perpendicular line. So let's say I wanted a point coming perpendicular up from the line between A2 and A3. Well, I'll start by clicking A2 first, and that gives me this perpendicular segment that I can move around until I choose which point I want to connect to. So I'm going to click A3. So let's go ahead and give that a length of 5 centimeters and click Apply. Now remember that Seamly likes to move counterclockwise for angles, so if you didn't want it to be a perfect 90-degree perpendicular, you could rotate Like I'll add 15 degrees in and click apply just so you can see what that looks like. I don't often rotate from the perpendicular tool, but I wanted to make sure I pointed that out. Actually, let's make that a little shorter. We'll click OK. Now notice A4 has a dotted line between it and A2. That means it's not going to automatically show up in our formula wizard unless we draw a line between these 2 points. So I'm going to click line. I'm going to grab the line between 2 points tool. I'm going to click A2 and then A4. The order in which you click things does matter in Seamly2D, and I would like this line to be named line A2, A4 and not A4, A2. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. Now would be a great time to show you how to delete things because sometimes you just put them in the wrong spot. So I'm going to click A4 and press delete. And I'm going to get this warning. It's going to say can't delete, the tool has children. And our child happens to be that line we just drew. So we have to delete that first, and then it'll let us delete A4. I'm going to go ahead and put everything back before we move on to the next tool. The next tool we're going to look at is the point on a bisector tool. If I click that, I need to be able to select an angle starting from one leg to the vertex to the other leg. So let's just use A to A2 to A4. And it will automatically bisect that angle for me. And because it's a perpendicular, it bisects into two 45-degree angles. Now I can choose the length if I wanted to. I could say, well, I want that to be 2 centimeters, or I could go into my formula wizard and choose one of my variables. Let's just go ahead and say hat brim length divided by 4, just to show you how that works. And notice again, we have a dotted line there. So if I think I'm going to use line A2, A5 later in life, now would be a good time to put a line down between those 2 points. If you don't think you're ever going to need that distance for something, it's okay to leave it as a dotted line. The next point tool we're going to use is going to be the point length to line. So start by selecting the point that you want your line to come from. So if I wanted to extend a line from A4 to meet the line past A1, I would select A4 and then select the first point of your line and the second point of your line. So now let's say I want 12 centimeters to be the length of my line, and that is the length of my line this direction along the hypotenuse. So we're going to hit apply, and I'm going to zoom out. You can use the buttons up here to zoom in and out, or you can control click and scroll, which is what I normally do. So now we've got A6 there. If we go into the properties and adjust it down, I can adjust it to 10, and that'll put it right here. But what happens if I put in a value like 2 centimeters? We know 2 centimeters is not nearly long enough for this hypotenuse to get me past A1. So if we try it, it simply puts our new number on top of the last point we selected. So you have to be careful about that and make sure you're keeping in mind that you are doing the length of the hypotenuse and not some length extending past A1 to A6. And just like the others, this one comes in as a dotted line. So if you think you're going to use this one later, go ahead and fill that in using the line tool now. So the next tool we're going to look at is intersect, arc, and line. So this tool is useful if you have a position where you want to imagine an arc sweeping from one point. So say A4, pretend I have an imaginary arc or circle around it with a radius that can swing out and hit our line down below, our line A to A3. So I'm going to start by selecting the line first. And as always, the order in which you click your points does matter, and I'll show you how in a minute. So we're going to say we want the line from A to A3. Our center of our arc is going to be A4. So then I can select a radius. We're going to say 2 centimeters. Let's go ahead and say 3, just so it's not directly on top. I'll hit OK, and then let's zoom in a little bit so we can really see what we're doing. So the point we created was A7. So that means if I had a radius of 3 centimeters extended from A4 and were to swing that arc down, A7 would be where that arc hits line A to A3. Now if I wanted to extend that a little bit, let's say 12, we can see that it would put that point way off in the distance, and that makes sense because the distance from A4 to A7 is going to be 12. So that's really useful when you want to guarantee how long your hypotenuse is swinging to hit a line. Very similar to the previous tool we looked at. Now let's adjust it again one more time. Let's bring the radius back down to something like 5. And notice that because when we create an arc we go counterclockwise, it's going to hit this section of A to A3, that line. It'll hit this section first and not this section on the right. So what if we wanted A7 to pop up on this other side? Well, we'd have to swap A and A3. Instead of deleting and regenerating, we can just change our first line point and our second line point and hit apply. So now, knowing that we have our first line point being A3, it's going to hit there. So more often than not, when you're working with arc tools and something's popping up on the wrong side or where you don't quite intend it, check and make sure that you've chosen your points in the same order. And I'm going to go ahead and delete A7 just because things are getting a little bit cluttered on our preview here. Okay, to accurately show the next one, I'm going to do just a little bit of setup. I'm going to grab my perpendicular tool and I'm going to create a perpendicular coming down from A3, and we'll make that our new A7. Now the next tool is called Intersect Axis and Triangle. I had to think about it for a second. So you start by selecting the first point of the axis you want your triangle to be on. So I am going to treat A to A6 as my axis. Then I'm going to select the first point that I would like to be a part of my triangle, which would be A4, and then the next one will be A7. It's a little bit confusing to see what this tool does, but notice that it's created a triangle with a 90-degree angle on my axis touching the 2 points I've chosen. This one's really kind of a niche case, but I thought I should point out how to use it just in case. Okay, get ready. This next one might very well be my favorite tool when I'm making squares and rectangles, and it's called Intersect XY. So what this does is I can choose any point to be my X or my vertical line, and then any point to be my Y or horizontal line, and it'll give me the point at that intersection. So if I want to point off here to the right of A7, but I want it to be the same distance away as A8 is from A3, and I want to make sure it's vertically in line with A7, so the same distance from A3 to A7 but below A8, I can click A8 and then A7 and it'll generate my new point A9. Super easy. Again, dotted lines, so if you want to reference any of these lines later, you have to go and fill them in. But really, I like this tool. Easy to use, super useful. The next tool I'm going to show you is really useful generating right angles where you need them. This is the intersection of a line and a perpendicular. So I'm going to select my base point, A8, and then you need to select your line. I'm going to select the first point as A5 and the second as A2. So what this does is creates a perpendicular for me. This is a right angle using A8 and then extending line A5 and A2. Okay, the last tool we have in the point category is the intersect line and axis. So we're going to select the first point of a line, and I'm going to use A to A3, and then I can choose any point to operate as my axis. So I'm going to grab A9, and what that does is allow me to generate any point from a line starting at A9 to reach this axis. And again, you can kind of guess and check where you want your point, why you need your point, and then you can go in and update it in properties. So I can adjust that angle if that's something that I know is going to be the same in all of my patterns. This isn't one I use as much as some of the others, but if it's something you think you could play with, I wanted to make sure I showed it to you. Okay, so the last tool I have to show you is the second one in the line category. And I like this one because it's really easy to use and it is useful. This is the Intersect Lines tool. So let's just say that I wanted the point that we would get if we extended A8 to A10 to hit line A9 to A11 here. So we're going to click A8 to A10, click A9 to A11, and there it is. It just extends and generates that intersection for you. And I think that's the last of the point and line tools we have to talk about. Now let's recap part 2. All designs start with point A. There are many different ways to place a point, though they all must reference an object that came before it. You can delete things, but only if no objects reference them. Make sure you delete all of the lines you've drawn to a point before you try to delete it. And going forward in this series, you can use the timestamps below to jump back and review specific tools. Our third topic will be curves and splines. Before we start talking about the tools in the curve section, I'm going to go ahead and use the point tools and just draw myself a rectangle to work with. And then as we go ahead and put our curves in, we'll fit them around this rectangle. So the first tool we want to look at is the interactive curve. I use this one quite a bit. So you only need 2 points to determine an interactive curve. So if I wanted a curve, say going from A1 to A2, I could drop it down. And then this one, you have a little more freedom to manipulate it within the Seamly editor and not in the properties menu. A word of caution though, if you're just adjusting it until it looks right and you're making a pattern that might be for multiple sizes, changing your measurements might throw your curves out of whack. So let's go into properties and I'll show you what I do to kind of avoid that problem. Let's see what I have in my, okay, cool. I do have line A1 to A3. So now I'm going to say, well, I want my first point to have a length of A1 to A3 and an angle of 0, because that was pretty close to what I had. And then my second point coming down, I want to grab the length A2 to A3. Come here. There we go. And an angle of 90. So now that's not quite what I wanted. I don't want it quite so boxy, but I'm going to go ahead and adjust my percentages of A2 and A3 until I get something closer to what I want. There we go. So now I know if this were a pattern where I were changing the size, my curve would stay the same relative to the lengths of A1, A3, and A2, A3. You want to keep that in mind when you're working with parametric modeling like we are here. And as we go through, I'm going to delete the curves after we make them because we've got quite a few to go through. Now let's look at the next curve tool. This is the fixed curve, and you need 4 points to determine a fixed curve. So let's see what that looks like. If I click from A1 to A3, A2 and back to A, we can follow the curve, and those anchor points are fixed. So you can't really change anything. Once you put that down, that curve is just going to be what it's going to be. And it's going to maintain that as you change your measurements. So if this curve is a good fit for you, you don't have to worry so much about being parametric. But let's delete it and put that same curve in a different way. A1 to A, A3 to A2. So you could also create a curve that sort of zigzags between and across the rectangle. I don't use this one a lot. I'm a little bit of a control freak and I like using the interactive curves just a bit more. Actually, let's keep this one because we can use our next tool on this curve. Our next tool is the point on a curve tool. So if I click that, and you can just click the curve, you don't have to click the endpoints or anything like that. We can also see the name, SPL underscore A1 underscore A2. Curves and splines are named the same way. So when you're generating a point on a curve, you can decide if you're going to go forward from the start point, and that is part of the curve. Remember, I started from A1 when I generated this curve. Or you can come backwards from the end point. And you could go ahead and say, well, I want to be 2 centimeters along this curve, and that'll break it up for you. Or you could go into the function, go into curve lengths, grab your curve. There's the whole length of my curve, and say, well, I want this point right in the middle of my curve. And there we go. It's a pretty useful tool and I like it quite a bit. I went ahead and deleted A4 before I show you this next tool, and I need to add another curve. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a curve between A and A3 here. And I don't know why I'm adjusting it until it looks the way I want it to look, but whatever. There we go. We've got 2 curves drawn. So to find the intersection of curves, you just click the Point Intersect Curves tool and click both of your curves, and it will find the intersection for you. Useful and pretty straightforward. Now let's go ahead and look at the interactive spline tool. Start by clicking a point at the start of your spline. You need to select 3 points from here. A spline needs at least 4 points. So I'm just going to use my rectangle here, and then I'm going to press enter to finish. But you could add more points if you want. And just like our interactive curve, you can click and drag and move the spline however you see fit. And you can adjust the lengths of the anchor points and the angles. And if you were so inclined, we could go into the properties window. And to edit this, you have to go through the paths and edit each one individually. Now, I'm not in the habit of fixing my splines with parameters, but you might be. So this would be how you do that. Now to show you the fixed spline, I actually need to extend my rectangle a little bit because I think you need at least 7 points to do that. So let's use some of my favorite tools to give us a couple more points to work with. And let's put one right in the middle there. Why not? Okay. So now let's grab the fixed spline tool, and I'm going to trace my way around until I've used 7 points. And once you've hit 7, you can continue to go, or you can hit enter. And now know that I cannot change this. This is fixed just like our fixed curve was. This is the way it will stay. Like, you can go through and adjust your pathing if you wanted to, but in the case of a spline, if it's not looking the way you would want it to look, I tend to delete it and just replace it with the appropriate curve. And just like we have a point on curve tool, we also have a point on spline tool. So you can just click, click, and again, you've got to decide if you're going forward from our starting point or backwards from the ending point. And this works the exact same way as the point on the curve tool. You can use your formula wizard if you want to go in and use one of your measurements to determine where that point goes, but it's the same tool just for the spline instead of the curve. Now the last tool I'm going to show you is Intersect Curve and Axis. So the first thing we want to do is select the curve. So I'm going to grab my spline, and then I'm going to select the axis point, and I'm going to click A6, and I'm going to use A3 as my other point. So that shows me where our curve would intersect this line. So it's similar to other intersection tools we've used, but it works both on your curves and on your splines. And I think that's it for the curves category. Let's recap part 3. If a curve or spline is fixed, other nodes are used to anchor the control handles. If a curve or spline is interactive, you can manipulate the control handles and use your parameters to adjust their length. If you are doing multiple sizes using these interactive tools, it's important to use parameters instead of just adjusting the control handles until you think they look right. As always, you can use the timestamps below to jump back and review this section. Our fourth topic is going to be arcs, circles, and ellipses. Okay, so I've gone ahead and cleaned up a little bit before we start this next section on arcs. We're going to start with the first tool, and the only thing you need to select on your draft block to create an arc with radius and angles is to select a center point. So we're going to go with A6. Let's say the radius is 1 centimeter, so we can look at it, set our first angle to 0, and our second angle to, how about 30 degrees? There we go. So see, it just draws the portion of the circle that would exist from 0 to 30 degrees. So if I wanted a quarter of a circle, I would punch in 90, 180 for a half circle, and 360 for a complete circle. So when I use this tool, oftentimes I want to make sure the circle is touching other things that I've drawn. So in this case, if I wanted my circle to just touch A3 and A2, it might be worthwhile to go into the formula wizard, go into line lengths, grab line AA1, which is this complete distance here, because we see AA1 over here. meaning if I wanted the radius, I should divide that in half, not by 5, and hit apply. So super easy tool to use. We're actually going to leave that arc up there for now so we can use it when we look at our next tool. So the next tool we're going to use is going to feel very familiar. It is the point on arc, and it works much the same as the point on line and point on curve tools. So we're just going to click our arc, knowing that because we said 0 degrees was the starting point of our arc and 360 was the ending, we need to think about our point moving this way if we come forward from the start point. So if I say I want a length of 1 centimeters, that makes sense. We see this green portion, that is our 1 centimeter away from where we started. And again, if you wanted to make sure, like, well, I want my point halfway across the circle, you don't have to calculate how far that would be. We can go into curve lengths, and our only curve right now is the arc we just drew. And let's divide by 2, and see that puts that on the complete opposite side. So just by using your variables, you should be able to get points pretty much anywhere you want them using this tool. I'm going to go ahead and clean up, and then we can talk about the next tool in the set. So before we look at the next tool, I want to draw an arc specifically to intersect A3 and A5. So let's go for a radius of 5, a first angle of 15, and a second angle of 85, and see how close I got. Okay, that looks pretty good. So what we can then do, we can click our intersect arc and axis. You start by choosing your arc, and then choosing your axis point. So now, see that I've got a point anywhere along that axis. So I could choose any angle off of A3 here. If I put in 0 or 360, it would give me the point on line A3, A5. Maybe I want a different angle, but again, we can click, go into properties, and adjust. Maybe I want something like a 45-degree angle. But yeah, you can take any point and draw a line at a particular angle to any arc you've drawn. Kind of a niche case. I don't use it a lot when I'm drafting patterns, but you might. I've gone ahead and cleaned up a little bit. So to use our intersect arcs tool, we need 2 arcs that actually intersect. So I'm going to go ahead and draw those really quickly. And let's just draw complete circles. Okay, and let's draw another circle off of A5 and just make sure they intersect. There we go. So when I use the intersect arcs tool, I should be identifying these 2 points. So intersect arcs, we select our first arc, we select our second arc, and there we go. It grabs A7 for us. So we can also specify if we want their first point of intersection or their second point. And if you need both, just go ahead and use the tool again, but pretty straightforward. After a little bit of cleanup, we're ready to talk about the intersect circles tool. And this one's kind of interesting because you are creating the intersection of 2 circles that are not currently drawn on your draft block. So I'm going to select A6 as the first center of my circle, and then A4 as the second. And just like the last tool, you can decide if you want to take the first point of intersection or the second. You can assign a radius to each circle. I'm just going to type in 5 and 3. They don't intersect, so it'll just put it as close as it possibly can. Let's nudge these a little bit closer. There we go. Now we've got 2 intersecting circles. And then I hit apply. And notice on my draft block, if I click away from A7, those circles disappear because they aren't actually added to our draft block. They just exist as a reference to show us how we generated A7 here. Kind of interesting and kind of nice if you don't actually need these circles as part of your pattern block and you're only using them to get the point A7 for something else later. The next tool we're going to look at is intersect circle and tangent. So the only thing we need currently on our draft block is the center of the circle and then the vertex where our tangent lines will originate. So I'm going to pick A6 as the center of my circle and A4 as the point on my tangent. So let's click A4 and A6, and then we just choose the radius of the circle around A6. So if I type in 1 centimeter and click apply, we can see that we get 2 lines originating from A4 coming off to meet the tangent of that circle on either side. Again, you can choose if you want the first point or the second point, which basically shakes down to the top point or the bottom point in this example. And as you adjust, notice we always have those tangent lines originating from A4 and touching our circle centered on A6. Again, not one I've really used for pattern design, but there's probably a cool quilting application in there somewhere, and if you figure it out, leave that in the comments for me. Before we use the next tool, which is intersect arc and tangent, I actually have to draw the arc. And once I have an arc drawn, this behaves fairly similarly to the last tool we looked at. So let's say we have a radius of 3, a first angle of 270, and a second angle of 90. Because I want to use A5 or A4, I think, as the vertex of the angle created by my tangent lines. So then let's click our tool. The first thing we're going to do is select a point on the tangent. Let's grab A5 and then we choose our arc. And notice how it automatically draws 2 tangent lines from A5 grazing the arc there. So if we right click and look at the properties of A8, we can decide if we want to take the first point or the second point. So if you want both, you have to use this tool twice, which isn't really a big deal. Very similar to the previous tool. Not very difficult to use, but again, this is not one that I use very often when I'm drafting patterns. Our second to last tool is one that I actually use quite a bit, and this is the arc determined by radius and length. So the first thing I'm going to do is choose my center point. I clicked A6. Let's do a radius of 5, a first angle of 0 to specify where it originates, and then I can just choose the length of the arc. Now at first glance, this might not be necessarily interesting, but I tend to use curves to draft ruffles. So if I knew that, say I had the bottom of a skirt and I knew the length of the bottom of that skirt and I wanted to cut some ruffles on a curve so that they would add a little more body and drape, this would be the type of tool that I would use to draft that piece. Let's go ahead and clean up there before we move on to ellipses. The last tool we're going to look at in this section is the arc elliptical, which will generate an ellipse. So choose a center point for your elliptical arc, and then everything else is determined numerically on the side. You don't really draw this one and adjust it later. So let's start just by using it to draw a circle. So if I set the first angle to 0, the second angle to 360, and the rotation angle to 0 and hit apply, I will get a circle. But an ellipse has 2 radii that determine its shape, so let's look at what happens if I change the second radius to 2. So notice it is stretched. So the first radius is our horizontal radius and our second is the vertical. If I don't need the whole ellipse, I can choose which portions I want, so I could do like from 15 to 85 or something like that, and it would chop up that ellipse just like we've chopped up circles and arcs earlier on in this tutorial. So let me put that back. And then our last option just allows us to rotate, and remember we rotate counterclockwise. So if I put a rotation angle of 15 degrees in there, we can see that our ellipse will start to rotate. And I have used this one to generate tops of hats, things like that, stuffed animal feet. This one is a tool that I use quite a bit. And that looks like the end of our arcs, circles, and ellipses category. Let's recap part 4. All arcs in Seamly2D are determined by a radius that is a certain distance from an origin point. Then either arc length or angles are used as the other parameter for the arc. Ellipses require 2 radii and 2 angles. And as always, use the timestamps below to jump back and review specific tools. Our 5th topic will be operations you can perform on the objects you've already created. So before we can use our first tool in the operations category, we have to go over to this group manager section that we've been ignoring so far and create a couple of groups. I'm going to hit the plus. I'm going to name my first group Group A. I'm going to leave it alone. I don't care that it's color-coded black. And then we'll create Group B. And then just to help me tell them apart, we'll make that a blue group. So now our first operations tool is add objects to group. So I'm going to highlight the left side, press enter, and add all of that to Group A. And then I'll grab A5 and A4 and add that to Group B. Now if there are things you want to remove from the group, just right click, and we have options to add a group object or remove group object. And we can view, hide, and we can also put objects into multiple groups. So I can put A6 into both groups. Maybe it's important to what I'm drafting and I want to see it no matter what. And that way I would have to hide both groups before A6 disappears. It stays present in the others. This is really useful when, say, I'm putting down a grid and then drafting a pattern on top of it, or maybe I'm looking at two different variations of sleeves or collars and I want to be able to hide what I've tried before I move on. You can also lock groups. So if you click the little lock icon next to it, that will prevent you from adding things in the group. So say if you want to put down a grid and then you want to make sure you don't accidentally add anything else to that group, you can lock it before you move on. Super useful tool. Try to make it part of your workflow because these draft blocks can get really unwieldy when you're making something complicated. The next tool we're going to look at is the rotate tool. So you can select one or more objects. So if I only needed a portion of this drawing, I could select just a portion, or I could select the whole thing. Let's go ahead and just grab this left half. And once you've selected what you want to include, if I want to add more, I can hit Control to make sure I'm including point A and click that. And then we'll press enter to confirm my selection. And now I need to choose what point I want to rotate it about. So if I want to rotate this portion about point A, I click point A as my center of rotation, and then I can do that. And then I click to determine the angle, let's say 45 degrees, where I would want that to go. And one thing you'll notice is it doesn't carry your lines with you, it just copies those points over. So if you wanted the lines connecting them, you'd have to go back to our line tool we talked about earlier and connect everything. Now everything that you copy carries a suffix, and you can tell which point it originated from because that's your prefix, A2, underscore A1 your suffix, and then as you continue to generate things you might see A2, A3, and if you change the letter of what you're working on, which I'll show you how to do in just a second, those will carry the appropriate suffix as well. If you decide you no longer like drafting all of your points named A, maybe some of them, like I like to use Z if I know it's not going to be a point that appears later. So if you go up to the top, change your letter, and create a point, it'll start naming Z1, Z2, so on and so forth. So if you feel like things are getting a little convoluted with all the A's, know that you can change and rename appropriately. The next tool we're going to use is Mirror by Line. And our next tool is also a mirror tool, so I'm going to go ahead and use line A5 and A6 as our example to sort of differentiate that. So let's say we want to mirror A1 and A3. And I can highlight those. If I want to add point A into the mix, I can Control click to add and remove that from the selection. And then I just press enter once I'm done selecting points. And then I choose the first point of my line and the second point of my line. And it gives me the option to change that suffix if I want to, but I'm going to leave it alone and press OK. So then we have A1, A1, and A3, A1, and that's what would happen if you would reflect these over line A5 and A6. The next tool we're going to look at is Mirror by Axis. Now this tool performs a little bit differently than Mirror Objects by Line. You can do everything with the Mirror by Line tool that you could do with the Mirror by Axis tool, but if you need this specific case, this could be a shortcut to get there. So I'm going to select A6 and A5 as our points that we're going to mirror, and then I'm going to select A2 as our rotation point. So then it dots in this vertical axis on A2, so I can't click that, drag that, adjust the angle. But if I hit apply, we can see if A6 were reflected, it would be in the same place, but A5 would be reflected over here on top of A1. If I change that to horizontal axis, we get a horizontal line. We can see A6 being mirrored across that line through A2, and we can see A5 down below. So if you have to mirror things and you know you're mirroring them directly over a horizontal or vertical line, this might be the tool that you want to choose. The next tool we're going to look at is the Move tool. So I'm going to select everything and press Enter. And then you have the option to move things as far away from the original as you want in whichever direction. Now the original is going to stay there. And then we can also choose an angle of rotation. So I'm going to go ahead and say 360. And that will push it out this way, a rotation of 0. And then a length we can punch in to determine how far away from the original we want it to go. So if I want it 90 degrees, that would put it vertically up above. And again, you can adjust where these objects move to. This can be useful if you need to duplicate a shape so that you can trace it multiple times. There is a tool later that allows us to merge pattern pieces that might be a little bit more useful. But keep in mind, it's not so much a move tool as it is a clone tool. And again, you will have to draw your lines back in if you want your piece to be the same as the one that you've copied. The next tool is really useful if you find yourself in a position where you need to make a dart. Now, I actually don't have the point set up to do this right now, so I'm just going to add some midpoints here and here. A little bit of a review from the point tools there. So when you create a dart, the first thing you're going to do is choose the line you want your dart to be on. So that will be the line from A to A5. Then select the first dart point, the second dart point, and the third dart point. So what I've done is create a trued dart, so it ensures that these lengths are the same, going through A7 and A8 on the line from A to A5. Now I have to confess, when I draw darts, I true them manually and I don't use the True Dart tool, but if you are just starting out, this could be a pretty useful option for you. The last tool we have to talk about in the operations category is pretty straightforward. It is the Export Draft Block tool. So if we click that, it will export your draft block. You can adjust the quality. You can choose from a variety of different files. Now, I don't take my draft blocks and operate with them in different programs, but I do take my pattern pieces and operate with them in different programs. If for any reason you want your draft block, this would be where you would export it. And that is the end of the operations category. Let's recap part 5. You can create groups to show and hide different objects, and your objects can belong to more than one group. Moving, mirroring, or rotating objects always creates copies of the objects that carry a suffix. You can export your draft blocks into a variety of different formats, and you can use the timestamps below to jump back as always. Our topic for part 6 will be pieces. You might notice things look a little bit different here, but before we move into actually generating pattern pieces, I wanted to make sure we had something that at least roughly looks like a sewing pattern. So here is my little doll dress with primitive shaping. This would be the front of the dress folded in half. Here would be the little sleeve that would go on it. And we're going to use this as our example as we draft pattern pieces. We're currently in draft mode. Notice if you click to try and change to piece mode, Seamly will tell us we can't use it yet. We have to create at least one pattern piece. So let's go over to the piece tool, click add new pattern piece. And the important thing to remember as you generate a piece is that you have to move clockwise as you select your points and curves. So I'm going to choose A14 as my first point. And if you're just going between two points that are in a straight line, you can go from point to point. I don't have to click the line between them. I don't have to click A7 or A unless I want to use them as notches later. So there's A11, and notice the red line will follow me. I can't just click from A11 to A9 because it's not going to assume that I want that curve. You have to manually click the curves. So let's go back. A9 to A10, A13, A6, then my final curve. Once you think you've got everything selected and outlined in red, press enter. You can double check the paths if you want. This part kind of throws me off because you don't get to hit the apply button until you've created your pattern piece, but we're going to press OK to create a pattern piece, and now we can go into piece mode. And now once we're in piece mode, you might notice that your pattern piece doesn't look exactly like you'd envisioned. If I were to make this dress, I wouldn't want a seam allowance across the front. Seamly automatically adds a seam allowance all the way around your piece, but that's okay. We can go into properties and we can adjust that. We might want to give our pattern piece a more descriptive name too. You can do that before you create the pattern piece, but I tend to forget. So we'll just name that dress. If you want to assign it a letter or determine how many to cut, you can mark it as placement on fold, which will come into play when you generate a layout later. Let's go into the seam allowance. So our seam allowance is by default set to 1.588 centimeters, which is approximately 5/8 of an inch. You can adjust that in your preferences if you want. I tend to leave it. Now, between A14 and A11 is where I want to remove the seam allowance. So I'm going to see what happens if I set after on node 14 to 0. There we go. So we can kind of see what we have to do to match this up. We have to find node A11 and set before to 0 as well. And there we go. We've removed our seam allowance. We've got a piece that we could cut out on the fold. And granted, this is very small and the seam allowance is very large, but I still think it's a good example of what we're doing. Now I'm going to show you how to use some of the piece tools that are back in draft mode. So if we go back to draft mode and piece category, we'll notice that these are no longer grayed out. We can use these tools now. The first one I want to show you is internal path, because it's probably the one I use most often. So imagine you want to put a line on your pattern piece. Maybe it's to show sewers where to place a pocket, maybe you just want to mark the waistline, but you can click any points that you want to show on your line, and I could keep clicking if I wanted to, but I just want the waistline. I'm going to press enter to finish my path creation. You can name your path. I'm going to name it waistline. It's an internal path. We can decide what type of line we want it to be. I think I want it dotted, and we're going to put it on dress. And if I hit OK and go back to my piece, now I have the waistline marked on my dress. The next thing I want to show you would be how to add notches to a pattern. So I've got a piece already created. Let's say I just want to add a notch halfway down A3 and A6. Maybe that's where some trim starts. Maybe there's something else I need to indicate. I just want to show you how this tool works. So I'm going to put a point between A13 and A6, just so we know that isn't part of my original pattern piece and we are adding it in. Just to note here, if you want to go in and change your draft block too much, if I were to grab A11, this curve, anything that is used to generate the shape of this piece, we would get the alert about the tool having children. So you can't delete things that generate your piece. So if you're getting that can't delete tool has children prompt, you might have to delete your whole piece and start over, depending on how dramatic your changes currently are. So there's A17. I'm going into piece. I'm clicking the Insert Nodes tool. I'm going to select A17 as a node, and I'm going to add it to my dress piece. I'm going to click OK. If I go over to the piece, in piece mode, I'm going to right-click and look at Properties. I'm going to see the paths. And now I need to decide where A17 goes into my workflow and what type of notch we want it to be. We're going to make it a T notch. I'm going to take away excluded, and this is going to get ugly, but I'm going to hit apply. So notice I don't have A17 currently counterclockwise in my program here, or in my pathing. So you might have to shift up and down a little bit to get your notch into the proper place. Like this is the biggest problem that I see when I put a notch in and it doesn't go in the right place. So there we go. This is appropriate. This is what I wanted. And then this notch will carry over into your pattern. And placing notches is a great way to make sure whoever's following your pattern can line their pieces up The next thing I want to show you are the labels that are available in Seamly2D. So really quickly, I'm going to grab my little sleeve piece here and add that as well. And now if we go to piece mode, I have both of my pieces. Cool. So now if we right click and go into the properties, we can go into labels. We get a piece label and a pattern label. Now if you're creating a pattern for production, you might want to edit your pattern label template, but normally I just edit the piece label template, hit plus to add a new field, and then you can choose. So if we want to do the pattern name and maybe the piece name, click OK and click apply. There we go. I haven't gone in and named this pattern yet. So if we go to pattern preferences, label data, we'll just name it test pattern. And then I can choose whether I want to show the pattern label or the piece label. Now the thing about this is if you're adjusting the labels here, there's the piece label. Let's edit the template. We can go ahead and save this template. Okay. And then import it on our other piece. So properties, labels, piece label, edit, import. Okay. Apply. And then let's set it to show. There we go. And you can click and move the labels and the grain line around in your pattern. If you click the corners of the grain line, you can rotate it because you know you're not going to draft everything on the grain line as you're making your own patterns. Now that we have our grain lines and labels on our pattern pieces, I'm going to show you how to add an anchor point to lock your grain line or your label. So I'm going to create a new point, and I just want to put it roughly in the middle of that pattern piece. So A18 here is going to be my anchor point. I'm going to go into piece. I'm going to click add anchor point. I'm going to choose A18, and that's going to be an anchor for the dress. Now when I go back to the piece layout, I can go into properties. When I go into labels, I can choose where to anchor that point, and I can grab A18 as that anchor. And that will make sure that that label stays fixed if that's something I care about. I can also do that to the grain line. I can fix the center of the grain line to A18 as well. Now I have to confess, I tend to take my pattern pieces from this point and export them out into Affinity Designer, but if you're using the print layout that I'm going to show you shortly, you might want to use the anchors as shown here. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to unite two pieces. Now, yes, you can click and drag your pieces around to overlap them, but that doesn't get rid of the seam allowance. It doesn't really tie them together. And sometimes in drafting, you are going to have separate pieces that you want to merge later. So I'm going to click the Unite tool over here. First, you click your pattern piece. I'm going to click the dress. I'm going to select my first point and my second point, so A10 and A13. I'm going to select my second pattern piece, my sleeve, and then my first point, A3 and A15. It says, do you really want to unite details? And then we click OK, and my two pieces have become merged together into a singular pattern piece. The last thing I want to show you when talking about pieces is how to export them. And this would be the tool that I use most often when I draft my patterns, because I don't use the layout in Seamly to get my patterns ready to sell. Let's go ahead and click export. This looks very similar to the export draft block function, and it works the same way. You have the same options. When you go in and look, you can export to all of these different AutoCAD formats. What I normally do is export to SVG and then manipulate my pattern from there. But I think that's all we have to go over in the piece category, and then we can move on to layouts. Let's recap part 6. Pieces are children of the points they reference, so if you want to go back and change your draft blocks, you might have to delete your piece first. You can unite two pieces by choosing two line segments to fuse together. You can also export your pieces into a variety of formats. This is really useful if you plan on using other software to complete your pattern. And as always, you can use the timestamps to jump back and review. Our final topic in the Basics series will be layouts and printing. Now that we've got a pattern, let's talk about how to actually print it. I went back and I generated another dress front piece and another sleeve, just so we could see how multiple pieces work in a layout. So from the piece mode, look at your grouping of pattern pieces over here, and if there are any you do not want to include in your layout, click the eye next to them and they will hide. So just to show you what that looks like, we're going to hide the piece that we united, and then I'm going to click the layout button. So if we set our layout to default, it automatically defaults to A0. The printer is print to PDF, because I'd assume most people save their patterns as PDFs and then print them using Adobe Reader. I'm going to go ahead and set it to letter and see if we can get it all to fit on letter pages, and we'll hit OK. So there we go. It finds the best position for the pieces to make the best use of your paper. And notice our union piece was not included. So if I go back to pieces, include our united piece, go back to layout, and then if I click new print layout, it will redo this all over again. So that gives me an additional page for that union piece, and then the same page for these two. If possible, it will fit them all on one page. So let's go back and restore default and put them all on an A0 page. There we go. We can see how small what I've drafted is, but using a combination of A0 or what you have on your printer, depending on the size of your pattern pieces, you should be able to get yourself set up pretty well to either print to PDF or print to tiled PDF. So once you've got your layout looking the way you want it, this is extreme, but I'm going to show you the export tool anyway. The layout was not updated since last pattern modification. It doesn't matter, I'm happy with my layout. You hit OK, and it will export the layout for you very similarly to the prior export tools we've looked at. So you could export just this layout if you wanted to chop up and make your own tiled PDF in a different program. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust my layout. I'm going to set it to A3 so I can get all of my pieces on this page, and then I'm going to show you how to print to tiled PDF. So let's go to File, Preview, Preview Tiled PDF, and notice it just breaks my pattern up into letter size sheets. So this breaks it up into 4 sheets. It gives me a dotted line to tape along. And if you do not plan on selling your patterns and they're just for personal use, this is probably the best way to get your pattern from Seamly into your hands and ready to sew. So then when you have looked it over, you decide it's what you want, then I would recommend going File, Print, Print Tiled PDF, and then just saving it as a PDF somewhere on your computer so you can refer back to it and always have it. But yeah, that's about it. You can now take yourself all the way through all of the tools to a finished printable pattern in Seamly2D. Let's do our final recap. Layouts can only be generated for paper that is larger than your pattern pieces. You can export your current layout in a variety of formats. If your pattern is for personal use, I recommend using the print tiled PDF so you can use your home printer. And again, you can use the timestamps to jump back and review whatever you need through this whole process. Thank you so much for watching. I hope the information in this video has given you what you need to take your first steps with Seamly2D. I hope to see you back on my channel soon.